Well, we're beginning this morning in Luke chapter 19. We're talking about a man we should all be pretty familiar with, for those of us who grew up in the church. You probably know the songs that have been sung about him and the little kids' lyrics that go with it. But there's a lot that goes through with this story, and that's short in just 10 verses. There's a big lessons that we can learn from a little man. But this story doesn't begin with Zaccheus. It begins with Jesus. In the verse 1, it's he, that is Jesus, entered Jericho, and he was passing through. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem for the last time. He's going into his final week. After 3 years, it's coming to a close. And he's going throughout all the region, visiting, preaching, spending as much time as he can, talking about the coming kingdom. And he heads down to Jericho. In the previous chapter, there's some interesting stories that occur. We talk about the rich young ruler, which we'll come back to in a little bit. And then there's Bartimaeus, the blind man, who he heals right outside of Jericho. And at this point, Jesus can't sneak by Jericho. His name is being spread all around the region. Jesus is here. Jesus is here. It's going out like a wildfire throughout the city, and everyone is beginning to flock to the gate. A large crowd is gathering. You can imagine all the people leaving the marketplace, headed to the front, all excited, in this grand movement there. And there's this little man sitting in a little booth in the dark corner of the market. He sees everyone running and can hear, Jesus is here. And a glimmer of hope appears in his eyes. And he gets up and he leaves the tax booth. Zaccheus makes his appearance. And there's a man by the name of Zaccheus, and he was the chief tax collector, and he was rich. There are a couple of things that we need to learn and establish about Zaccheus. First off is that he's a tax collector. He's a man of questionable reputation and all this. Tax collectors are not the greatest people in the world during this time. They didn't represent their own people, their own nationalities. They represented Rome and her interests. But that's how Rome worked. They didn't send their own people out. They gathered nationals and other people of the land. So Zaccheus is a Jew, but to the other Jews, he's considered a dirty Jew. He's a man who has turned his back completely on his people. He's a traitor. He's a dog. He's a scoundrel because he doesn't protect his brethren. He stands with Rome. He stands with the man, with the government. And they don't like that at all. One of the things we learn about tax collectors is that they're notoriously over-taxers, and they'll extort you for anything they can. Now, the taxes with Rome were pretty heavy. You had a 1% tax on income, sales, import, export, emergency taxes, provisions, and then their produce taxes were just outrageous. Rick can understand how crazy this would be. There's a 10% tax on all the grain that you have. So say you grow 100 acres. 10 acres of that grain is already claimed by Rome. That's a lot of grain. If you grew wine, had wine, fruits, or olives, that was 20%. That's a lot to be sent back in taxes. But these men were notorious for claiming and wanting more. So say he would come to you and say, all right, this year I want 5% of everything. And you're going to say, hold on. I know it's only supposed to be 1%. Why would I pay you extra? And as you're arguing with him, a couple of big, burly Roman soldiers walk up and just, is there a problem? And you just back off and say, no, and you hand over whatever they're asking for. Tax collectors were not very favorable, but Zaccheus had an even greater problem. He's the chief tax collector. So not only is he taxing the people of Jericho in this, he also gets to go and tax and extort the other tax collectors, and then he takes all of everything that's owed to Rome, and he takes that himself and goes to Rome. He's a man of great importance in all of this, but he's a man of great sadness out of this. But what we do learn as well is because of his ability to tax and steal from people, he becomes a man of excessive wealth. He's a very rich man. He says in verse 8 that he got his riches from taxing other people, and he says, if I've taken and defrauded anybody, I'm going to give 4 times back. It's how he got his riches. And an interesting note out of all this is that this is the second rich man that Jesus has interacted with in the past couple days. So again, remember the rich young ruler. We're going to come back to him in Zaccheus later. And then the third thing we learn about Zaccheus in the next verse is that, well, I'll put it this way. They say that preachers need to find a commonality with characters to really bring them to life. And I have my commonality with Zaccheus. We're both short. We're both little men. He's a man of small stature. He looks a little different than other people because he's short. A lot of people are taller, and it's causes him some interesting dynamics in this story out of all this. But so far, we're not painted a very favorable picture of Zaccheus. He's a man despised by his people. He's a man we can really see probably despises himself out of everything. And there's not a lot of hope in his life. He's a lonely man. He's a quiet man. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn out of this. And our biggest question for this morning is this, is what big lessons can we learn from such a little man? Well, the first is going to be this, is that he's a man of spiritual curiosity. He's not going to give up. Verses 3 and 4, and he was trying to see who Jesus was. And he was unable to because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up in a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. So Zaccheus hears what's going on. He can see the crowd gathering. He tries to get in to see, who is this man Jesus? I've heard all these great stories and things about this man Jesus. I want to see him. And the crowd's not letting him through. Well, it could be an innocent reason. I mean, again, this is like the Macy's Day Parade for these people. Jesus has come in. Everyone's gathered together. Have you tried? Remember growing up, going to parades and being a short little kid? You had to worm your way through, push your way through. People had to either let you in or they had to put you up on their shoulders so you can see. The crowd is so excited. He's not getting through, but there could be a level of ill intent in this. He's at the back trying to maybe worm his way through. He said, hold on, I want to see Jesus. And the people look back at him and say, wait a minute, you, Zaccheus? You? No, sir. You don't get to see the Lord. You don't deserve to see this man, Jesus, this man of God. Get out of here. Go. You don't deserve this, you dog. Imagine just that, what that must have felt like for him in all of this, if that was what they did. But this is not going to stop Zaccheus out of all of this. In fact, we see the next thing about him is he's a man of intense determination. He can't get through the crowd, so he sits and thinks, okay, what can I do? What can I do? There's a tree on the way. He's going to head to the market. There's a tree I can go climb up into so I can have a chance to see this man Jesus. And he does that. But have you ever seen what a sycamore tree looks like? There it is. This is actually a Middle Eastern sycamore tree. This is the actual tree, one of the actual trees from the region. Look at how it just sprawls out and is grand and all this, but it's not a terribly tall tree. That a short man like Zaccheus could get up there, but he's still within the eyesight of Jesus as he comes down the path. He can see him. He might even be close enough to reach down and touch him, or maybe just be in the presence. For some of those stories that come out of Jesus is that if you want something or need something, a great healing in your life, you only need to just be in his presence to receive this. There's a hope in Zaccheus' life. Jesus is healing the sick. The stories, healing the sick, healing the lame, giving the blind vision. He just did that outside of Jericho. The dead are raising, but again, most importantly to Zaccheus, he knows that sinners are being forgiven and saved. There's a hope for him in all of these things. And then in verse 5, Jesus comes under the sycamore tree. And he reads, when Jesus came to that place, he looked up to him and said, Zaccheus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. Zaccheus saw himself as a lost cause. The people saw himself as a lost cause, somebody who's not worthy of being in the presence of the Lord. But instead, when Jesus comes by, he doesn't just stop, he just doesn't pass by under the sycamore tree, ignoring who's up there. He stops, looks up, and can see something that he's been looking for in the crowd this whole time. He sees a heart. He sees a heart that's looking for him, who's yearning for something that Jesus can do for him. And then he calls him down by name. How that must have felt for Zaccheus, a man who's we can establish as a lonely man, a man who's exiled really by all of his brethren. And yet this man of great importance of power is coming down and saying, You, Zaccheus, I know you by name. Never met you before. Don't know if I've heard anything about you, but I know you by name. Come on down. There's something that we need to do today. How that must have felt in Zacchaeus' heart to know that the Lord is calling him. In fact, Zacchaeus, it says, doesn't take his time to get down. I can only imagine that Zacchaeus, in that short tree you can see, hops down and lands. He doesn't land on his feet, he lands on his knees at the feet of the Lord, ready to hear what he has to say. And he receives him gladly. He's so joyful. The Lord says, I'm going to come to your house today, Zacchaeus. We're going to spend some time together today. The pride and amazement that must have been in his heart, knowing that the Lord is going to be at my house today, and then remembering, what does Jesus do? What happens when Jesus comes to people's houses? Great things occur and great things happen. And for Zacchaeus, sinners are saved. Just pause for a second and think about that. Just the feelings that must have been in his heart. The excitement, the joy. That moment of just, yes. That pride, just, yes. And then we move into verse 7, where the crowds decide, all right, let's pop that bubble of Zacchaeus', that happy, joyful bubble. And when they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he is gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner? The crowds are saying, Jesus, are you really going to do this? Don't you know who this man is? He's a tax collector. No. He's the chief tax collector. He's betrayed all of us to Rome. Hold on, Jesus. The crowds again, forget this. Aren't you supposed to be overthrowing Rome? Aren't you supposed to be overdoing all of these things? How dare you go to this man's house? What are you thinking? That's what the crowd is saying and thinking in all this. You've got to feel for Zacchaeus. So excited, then just take all of that away from him. Pause for a moment of reflection for us, though, and Chris did a great job with this last week, as Breck mentioned. Have they forgotten who their neighbor is? Have they forgotten what it must have been like and felt like for Zacchaeus? They're sinners too. But they have this same issue as we have today, I think, of beginning to label out and level up sins, that some things are worse than others. I mean, to be fair, Zacchaeus really did have breaking about a third of the old law in all of his stealing from people and mistreatment of his neighbors and things like that. But how often do we have that same attitude in things? Chris gave us such a good encouragement and even admonishment in that this past week about remembering who is our neighbor and focusing on that. Point of reflection just in that is, do we have that same attitude as the crowd sometimes? Should we have that same attitude as the crowds? I think not. But then Zacchaeus does something pretty amazing, pretty wonderful in all of this. And you see that even though it's going on, he shows his true character in things. He's a man of penitent character. What he says in verse 8, it's quite amazing. He says, he stops and says to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. Look at that scene right there that happens with Zacchaeus. He doesn't under his breath say this. He doesn't kind of just go along with Jesus and say this. Zacchaeus says, hold a minute. There's something I need to say. And he doesn't looking at the crowd in this. He's looking at the Lord. He's looking to the Lord. And he realizes something important. If he really wants to make this change, if he really wants to have this hope of salvation that he's striving for Jesus, he's going to have to make some things right with the crowd behind him and right with himself in this. He's going to have to change his life drastically. But again, remember I mentioned earlier, reflect back on the rich young ruler. This is time. So go over to Luke 18. Luke chapter 18, verses 18 to 23. We're going to see real quick a comparison of these 2 rich men who Jesus interacted with within a couple of days of each other and the drastic difference between the 2 of them. Luke 18:18 says, "A ruler questioned him, saying, 'Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And Jesus said to him, 'Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother.' And he said, 'All these things I have kept since my youth.' And when Jesus heard this, he said to him, 'One thing you still lack. Sell all you possess, distribute it to the poor, and you shall have a treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me.' But when he heard these things, he became very sad, for he was an extremely rich man. And in Mark's account, it said that he hung his head and went away sad. He left the Lord because he was a very rich man." Quite a difference of reactions between these two very rich men. They actually have a lot of commonalities, though, at the same time. First off, they're both very rich and abundant in the physical blessings of this world. One maybe got them a different way than the other, but they still have that commonality. They're rich men. And then they both are seeking the same thing. They both want a hope for eternal life. The young rich man asks directly, "What shall I do to inherit a hope?" And then Zaccheus asks it through his actions and the way he goes about trying to seek the Lord. And you can see that in his heart. And that's the other thing they have in common, is they both are seeking after the Lord. One goes to him, the other climbs a tree to find the presence, but they both are seeking the Lord for one reason. But the difference is that one walks away in shame and in grieving, and the other takes his shame and grief and gives it back to the people who he's wronged. He's taken that shame, which is his riches, and has given it back to the people in all of this. Quite a powerful contrast, and Jesus must have felt so encouraged, because now he told the apostles there, they asked, "How can a rich man enter then?" He says, "It's easier for them to enter, or it's easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven." He's found his camel who can get through the needle right there. And then Jesus gives a joyful, amazing statement in verses 9 and 10 that picks Zaccheus back up. They tried to pop his bubble and break his attitude, break his heart. But Jesus gives an amazing statement to him in verses 9 and 10. And it reads, "And Jesus said to him, 'Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and save that was lost.'" He's addressing both Zaccheus and the crowd in this. Jesus sees a heart that wants to change, and a heart that's seeking the Lord and seeking salvation. It's a heart that he couldn't find in the rest of the crowd. And all those righteous people, he could not find a heart after him, but he sees it in Zaccheus. And we can feel that joy and that excitement in what Jesus is saying, and when Zaccheus hears that, salvation has come to my house today. Wow. I can feel the Lord with me today. And then Jesus gives this great explanation, answers their original question of the crowd. They say, "Is he really going to go spend time with these sinners?" And he answers in the last verse and says, "Of course, because the Son of Man did not come to seek the righteous, to save the righteous. He came to seek and to save that which is lost." And you know what? Up to his last hours, he's not done seeking to save the lost in all of this. Zaccheus sought and was saved in this. Powerful story out of this little man. So we always ask the question, how does this apply to us? What can I do to bring this into my life? And I found a couple of points for us to think about and focus on today. And the first is this, is that salvation is for all. That anybody is a candidate for salvation. Zaccheus is considered at this time as the bottom of the barrel Jew. He's the last person that you would expect to be seeking after religious and righteous things. I mean, this man's not even allowed in the synagogue because of his state of things, who he hangs out with, Gentiles, other tax collectors, Romans. Not a righteous man, not a man that would have been thought of at all as heaven-worthy. But that's not what the Lord sees in him that day. The Lord sees somebody who is beyond heaven worthy at this point, is somebody who's seeking to be with him. And just like Jesus does, we cannot and should not exclude anybody from the joyful amazement that is a grace in the Lord and salvation that's in Jesus Christ. And Chris hammered that so perfectly this last week with us. Who is my neighbor? Remembering that fact of who is my neighbor. And to be fair, I wrote this sermon before Chris gave any of this stuff, so it worked perfectly together in all of these things. And the second point of all this is that we need to strive for salvation. If we want salvation, we have and need to strive for it. Look over at Luke 13, verse 24. Luke 13, 24. It says, "Strive to enter through the narrow door, for many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able to." There's a difference here between striving and seeking. Striving let's put it this way. Seeking is a look. It's looking. I can see, I'm trying to find it, but striving is the action. Striving is running and climbing the tree. Striving is not letting the crowd keep away from you. And striving is standing with your back to the crowd announcing, it's time to make a life change, and here's what I'm going to do. We see in Zaccheus that difference between seeking. As the crowd was seeking, Zaccheus was striving. And Zaccheus let nothing stop him from seeing the Lord. The crowds would not stop him. His height would not stop him. His current religious standings and things, his relationship with the Lord, was not going to stop him from seeking what he needed most in his life, what would bring him true happiness. The question we ask for ourselves is what is stopping me? What is stopping me from striving for salvation in this relationship with the Lord? What is stopping me from being a Zaccheus? There's a great story that could go along with all this that Jordan told me the other day. It's really brought this down to earth for me. So there's a woman, a righteous woman, a good, godly woman, doing all she can to raise her family and her children in a righteous home. Yet the husband, the father, doesn't want anything to do with the Lord, doesn't want anything to do with the church, doesn't want anything to do with Jesus. That's her thing to deal with. But to the point now, it's gotten annoying, maybe even a bit of embarrassment to him, that she's going on Sundays to do this. And he decides he's going to spend a couple of weeks to trap her and see what she can do, to see if she's really this devout person who's seeking and striving the Lord. That first Sunday, he goes and turns off all the alarms, thinking, all right, if she doesn't wake up on time, she's not going to go. Why would she embarrass herself and the kids coming into church so late? I've got her with this. But because she set herself up for success the night before, and all of those years before, she wakes up on time anyways, gets the kids ready, and they go to church. Rats. All right. The next week comes along. I got it. He takes the kids, wakes them up a little early, makes them this fantastic breakfast, pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, the works. Got them all in their PJs, puts on the Sunday morning cartoons. I got them. They're not going to want to go with her this morning. But like any good Sunday morning mom does, she gathers all the kids up, gets them dressed, gets them in the car, and they make it to church on time. I've got it. He knows what he's going to do. In fact, it seems that the forces of nature are working with him for this last week. Saturday night, there's a great snowstorm comes down, covering everything. They wake up, the driveway's completely coated in snow. She goes out there and she shovels all the snow off, freeing the car. And then she goes back inside to start getting the kids ready, and he sneaks out to the garage and takes all the spark plugs out of the car. She's not going anywhere today. I got her. She's not going to walk in the snow and cold. She's not going to take the kids and walk to church. I've got her. I've got her today. And so she goes out there, tries to start the car, won't start. And he's sitting inside, smugly just waiting. Just waiting for her to come in. She does. And he says, car won't start? Man, guess you aren't going to church today. Rats. Guess you're not going to church today. She doesn't say a word to him. Just walks in, goes to the closet, pulls out a thick, heavy coat, puts it on, puts on some gloves, puts on a scarf, and then proceeds to get the rest of the big, heavy coats out for the kids. You know, by the time they're done, they all look like big, fluffy marshmallows. They all head out, and they're walking to church that morning. And he sits and he reflects and just thinks, what am I doing? What am I doing in all of this? Why am I trying to stop her from this? What reasons do I have? And his heart becomes pricked. So about halfway through service, he shows up in that car. He puts the spark plugs in, shows back up. And he meets her afterwards with tears in his eyes and says, thank you. Thank you for striving after the Lord. Thank you for living his life for us. Thank you for being Zaccheus, for not stopping no matter what is putting against you, for not stopping and seeking the Lord. He comes back to her because she had a Zaccheus life. Zaccheus was a wee little man, but he had big plans and he had a big heart, and the Lord had big plans for him. Zaccheus knew he was missing something in his life, and he was going to do everything in his power to fix that. We see he swallows his pride, and he climbs a tree. He ignores all the attacks, all the things that happen from his Jewish brethren to try and stop him from being with Jesus, and he stops and puts his focus all back on Jesus. He gives up all of his physical wealth, everything that would have brought him joy or he thought would bring him joy in his life. He gives it all up because he knows that there's a greater wealth waiting for him in eternity with the Lord. Wee little man with big heart. So the question we have to ask ourselves out of all of this, out of everything from this morning's story, is, are we humble enough to follow this example? Are we humble enough to swallow our pride and to seek after the one who can give us that hope? Are we humble enough to put away all the extra things in our life that we think are going to bring us joy and happiness and gratitude for something that's so great for later on? Are we humble enough to follow the instructions of the Lord when he says, come down because I'm going to your house today? We say Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in that sycamore tree for the king he wanted to see. How far are we willing to go for our king? Are we willing to climb up in that sycamore tree because the king we need to see?